King Solomon, as the Bible tells us, was the wisest man to ever live. He had a gift for administration that no one before or since has come near. He wrote and collected proverbs, the gathered wisdom of the ages. So if you're doing the McShane, you've started through Proverbs. And we've just got, I think yesterday, to the Proverbs of Solomon, the ones that he wrote down. And yet Solomon's grandeur and glory was so impressive that when he built the temple that we name after him, we call it Solomon's temple, don't we? When he built that temple, he fooled himself, perhaps more significantly than anyone else in all human history. We're thinking about the temple again this morning. But we're thinking this morning about the physical temple. We're considering the place it had in the spiritual life of Israel and God's sovereign plan, like we've been seeing from Genesis onwards, for all nations. We're going to do three things. We're going to think about its place, its purpose, and its pattern. I don't alliterate that often, do I? So, give me some credit. Its place, its purpose, and its pattern. 3 P's. Firstly, let's consider its place. Now, there's a couple of different aspects to consider here. Now, to begin with, it's worth noting that the Old Testament temple was always meant to be located at the heart of the children of Israel. It was to be central to the individual and to national life. God's elect, his chosen people then and now, therefore, should have the worship, the word, and the service of God at the centre of everything we do. It is to be the sun around which we orbit. It should be accessible for all, from the greatest to the least, from the oldest to the youngest, from the brightest, you could say, to the simplest. Think of how Israel in the wilderness would follow where God led and then stop where he commanded. And then the tabernacle, for those of you who don't know, that was the mobile version of the temple that Israel used before the temple was built. And you could say that the temple was just built after the pattern of the tabernacle. This tent, this mobile temple would be set up, and Israel camped around it in the divisions of their tribes. It was right in the middle of the nation of Israel. And Jerusalem, because by the time we get to 1 Kings 8, we're in the city of Jerusalem, it served a similar purpose in Israel. And at this point, we're talking about Israel and Judah as one unified nation. It's not long, it's just after Solomon that it splits into two, but at this point, it's still one nation. And it was in a fairly central location to Israel and Judah. It was tied to the history of the patriarchs. It might have been the very same mountain, and there are plenty of people, not only Muslims and Jewish people, but Christians as well, who believe it was the same mountain where Abraham bound Isaac to be sacrificed. Mount Moriah, that's the thing to look up in a Bible dictionary. It was Jerusalem, at the intersection of trade routes heading to every compass point of the ancient world. If I'm looking at, I don't know if anyone has ever played Rome Total War, but it's quite fun. You can follow these routes. I think it went from Jerusalem down to Petra, and it was just in the middle of these amazing trade routes that connected east to west and north to south. And this, by the way, links God's plan in calling Israel as his people in the first place. Because God made it clear when he called Israel. He did that through Abraham, and he called Abraham like we've been seeing in Genesis. And then we see Abraham's son and Isaac and grandson, Jacob, who gets called Israel. That's where we get the name of the nation from. Then his 12 sons, and they become a people as they come out of Egypt. When he called them and he gave them the land, and he said, you're going to live here, he made it clear that they weren't to get the wrong impression of themselves. They were no better than any of the pagan nations around them. That's not why he chose them. He was calling them out of the nations to call the nations back to him. Now, their national distinctives that they were to have as Israel, the reason that Jewish people in the Old Testament are just different to everyone around them, was to make them stand out. They were made to look different. God gave them things that would make them stand out and be different. The way they dressed, the way they ate, how they spoke, the manner that they lived. They weren't meant to be like the people around them. They were called to showcase the life of faithfulness. And so when people say, why do you cut your hair that way? Or why do you have these things tied to your wrists or on your forehead? They would say, well, let me tell you what God has done for us. The God who created the heavens and the earth. We're different because of what God has done for us. They had a distinctive class of priests. We read about that a little in the reading, the sons of Aaron. But they were to be a nation of priests, extending the rule and reign of the Creator God over the nations. We were talking about this a little bit on Thursday night. We weren't really meant to be, but we ended up doing that at our missionary prayer meeting, at an impromptu Bible study. Zion, that's another name for Jerusalem, it was meant to be a light on a hill to show every other people the way out of the darkness they were in. Psalm 96, 2-3 says, "Sing to the Lord, praise his name, proclaim his salvation day after day, declare his glory among the nations, his marvelous deeds among all people." As the garden temple of Eden, we talked about that last week, was intended to glorify God and spread his praise across the earth, so the temple in Jerusalem. Its place was important. Unbelieving historians, maybe if sometimes it's the kind of thing that will pop up on Facebook from time to time, they will mock at the idea of so much apparent spiritual significance happening in such a small corner of the world. They'll sort of get a map of the world and draw an outline of where most of the Bible happens and say, it's so centric to a certain area, it can't be real, and they make fun of it. But look at where the temple was placed in that small area of the earth. It's at the point where every geopolitical superpower of the ancient world could access it, with trade routes that allow for the movement of ideas and people. They could hear about it. Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, the Phoenicians, the Hittites, the Cushites, all these different Ite people, they had access to it. If they wanted it, they could go and meet with the God of the world. We even see a hint of this starting to happen when the Queen of Sheba visits Solomon in chapter 10, just a couple of chapters' time. The temple is placed on a hill from which blessing can flow from Israel to the nations. Let's think more about that then. That's the place. Let's think about the purpose the temple. This is our second P of the day. Purpose. Now, chiefly, as we see here, it was meant, this is like last week. We're not reinventing the wheel here. It is what it sounds like. It was a dwelling place for God. In the ancient world, a temple was a place for the God of that temple to live. And that's what this was. A dwelling place for God. If you look at verse 13, isn't that what Solomon has in mind? "I have indeed built a magnificent temple for you, a place for you to dwell." The ark was brought with great reverence. We saw that, an appropriate ceremony into the temple. Not because it was a magic box that had great powers. That's what Hollywood thinks, and it's foolish. It's really sad. You learn too much, and it spoils a film you used to love. I watched Raiders of the Lost Ark, and I'm like, that's just rubbish, that, isn't it? What a shame. This box was a footstool. It was a symbol of God's sovereign kingship, a visible sign of his invisible presence among the people. It was a declaration to all that this is where the Lord God reigns. Now his throne, you don't have a model of his throne because that's in heaven. But his feet rest on the earth because he's the king over it. So let's get him a footstool to show that. So straightforwardly, like I said, the temple was a place for God to live. Kind of does what it says on the box. It could never contain him. Solomon knew that. We read in verse 27, I read it last week as well. But will God really dwell on the earth? The heavens, even the highest heavens, cannot contain you. How much less this temple I have built? So that's where Solomon's being wise. He gets it here. It couldn't contain him, but in his grace, God would condescend to be present there. He would really turn up. It was a place that he was willing to meet with his people. Now, while the temple was there, the children of Israel would know that God was with them. They would know he was accessible to them. They could pray to God at the temple and know he was there. Their prayers would be heard. The temple, first and foremost, was a place for mankind to meet with God. It was a place for God to live with his people. And if those Gentile nations, if they hear, like, there's something going on in Israel, God is present there, well, if they want to meet God, they know where to go. Go to the temple. You might not be allowed in, but you can meet with God there. But that wasn't the only purpose of the temple, was it? Of this temple. Now we get a hint of this from the reading, only a hint. You might not have noticed the violence here, but this is one of the bloodiest chapters in the Bible, isn't it? Just look at verse 5. King Solomon and the entire assembly of Israel that had gathered about him were before the ark, sacrificing so many sheep and cattle that they could not be recorded or counted. Do you know how you sacrifice an animal? You cut its throat, you drain it of blood, you butcher it, and you burn it. These sacrifices are gifts to God. They're thank offerings. That's what's happening here. They're signs of the gratitude and praise of his people. That's why you burn up the meat. You're sort of giving it to God, and it can kind of ascend to heaven. It's a picture of that. Giving up something valuable. But it gives us a sign that sacrifice is one of the chief purposes of the temple. Because the blood must have been running in rivers down this hill. The temple, yes, it was a place for God and man to meet, but what's the problem? Since Eden, mankind is fallen. We're sinners, aren't we, by nature? Just how we turn out, how we come out of the womb, with a propensity to sin and make bad choices. And choice. We just choose to sin sometimes. We can know it's a bad idea, but we think, but I want it. I want to do that. I want to say that. So we're sinners, but God is holy. He's completely morally pure. He's separate by his nature from sin. And sin cannot coexist with a holy God. It's like putting a petri dish of bacteria into the heart of a nuclear reactor. They will be completely obliterated, atomized. In our reading, we saw the visible presence of God appear in the temple. That cloud in verse 10 is the glory cloud of God. It's what was seen on Mount Sinai. It was the cloud that led Israel through the wilderness. It was the cloud that appeared in front of the disciples on the Mount of Transfiguration. It's a symbol, a picture that God is imminently present. And notice this in the reading. The priests, no less, aren't able, in verse 11, to perform their service because of the cloud. I think there was a hint to them there if they'd been willing to pay attention. The very people set aside to be holy for God. That was the job of the priests, wasn't it? They were set aside to be holy for God. Read Leviticus. It's hard going, but you read about all the ways they've got to prepare themselves to go and make sacrifices for the rest of Israel. They're set aside to be holy. That's why it's so repetitive, isn't it? It's giving you all these, it's like a manual, a priest's manual. And it does a lot more than that. Leviticus is great, but it's hard going. They were the very holy people set aside to serve God, and they're not allowed to be in his presence. They cannot survive there. It is too dangerous. The purpose of the temple was to provide a way of removing the defilement of sin. And this was through the sacrificial system. Mankind was guilty, like we've seen, lock, stock, and barrel. Psalm 14, there is no one who does good. Mankind deserved death. Rather than the blessing of God, death. And so, for mankind to enjoy life with God, which, remember, is God's plan. It was always God's plan for people, for us to be with him. And so, to make a way around that, blood has to be shed. And God kindly provided a system. That's another reason to get excited about Leviticus before I lose myself in my notes. Sins, individual and national, could be atoned for by blood sacrifice. People could be cleansed and assured of God's forgiveness. Just as Solomon prayed in verse 30, they could come and worship the Lord in the beauty of holiness, and they'd be able to do so. So that's the purpose. Plan, purpose, or place, purpose, there we go. Plan would have been another one. Let's think about the pattern of the temple. Thirdly, pattern. Because you're probably wondering, how did Solomon fool himself? Because it's a bold claim for me to make, isn't it? To assume superior wisdom to the wisest man who ever lived. And those of you who know me know that that's not necessarily something that fits me very well. What mistake, then, did King Solomon make? Well, there's a story told about the Roman Emperor Justinian, who, when he'd finished building the Church of the Holy Wisdom, what gets called the Hagia Sophia, in Constantinople, which is now Istanbul. There's a song about that. And apparently, he gazed up at the magnificence of this cathedral built at his command. And if you've seen pictures of it, it still is an amazing, beautiful building. And he looked up at it and he said, Solomon, I have outdone thee. Because he was saying that his cathedral, what he'd had built, was even bigger and grander than Solomon's, which was the greatest ever made. So poor Justinian, just like Solomon, seems to have been bamboozled by the epic grandeur of an impressive building consecrated to the worship of God. And if we'd read the chapters before and after our reading, it would be easy for us to be taken in the same way. Because as you read these careful, and it's really precise, these chapters, describing the temple and the utensils for the service in the temple, we can see it in our mind's eye, the beauty and the wonder of this temple, its precincts, its decor, its furnishings. You know, it's the same way that we today in this country can walk into a Gothic cathedral and be awed. It's jaw-dropping at times, walking into some of these buildings. You're drawn upwards because they're built that way to make you look up. You can't help but crane your neck at these great vaulted ceilings and the fabulous stained glass. How on earth do they get such big stained glass windows? They must weigh a ton. And it's beautiful, the colour and the architecture. And we see it and we think, well, what could improve on this? What place could be more sacred? You know, maybe there's a bit of choral playing song in the background and it's very quiet and you just feel kind of reverent walking in, don't you? Our senses are so overwhelmed that we lose sight of the higher reality that these buildings are patterned after. That was a mistake that Justinian and Solomon made. To be so impressed at this building, which was impressive, that you lose sight of what it is a picture of. Solomon was so impressed at the work of his own hands, and he had forced labour, so it wasn't even the work of his own hands. And he thought that this temple was an end in itself, a permanent thing. Now, it was the biggest, most impressive building that anyone in Egypt had ever seen. There's no doubt about that. Solomon's temple was a big deal. You remember when the exiles return from when they get kicked out of the land and they come back and they build the foundation of the new one, and they weep when they remember what the temple used to be like. They've got this little footprint of a temple, and they weep. It's just nothing to compare with Solomon's. But Solomon, who knew, as we've seen, that it was still far too small to fit the God of the universe into it, he thought that it would be a permanent dwelling place for God with his people. That's what he says in verse 13. I deliberately didn't read that word earlier. A place for you to dwell forever. He thought that this was it. It's like eternity starts now. He thought that this was the final reality of God's dwelling place with man. And good as it might seem, and it's presented positively in this chapter, it's not like, oh, this is really bad, look at this. But there's stuff to think about. Because it's a way for men to be with God, or for people to be with God, dependent on the faithfulness of a flawed king. And Solomon, for all his greatness, he was one of the greatest kings, or the greatest king Israel ever had. He was also one of the worst. But you see what happened. It was a hope which was conditional. It depended on the sacrificial system and the law of Moses being maintained. And by the time Israel is exiled, that's just degenerated into a complete mess. The wise Solomon didn't seem to understand that the temple was meant to function as a signpost. It was a temporary institution which would eventually pass away and be replaced by the truth it was meant to symbolize. It wasn't itself absolute. As the writer to the Hebrews said, it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. It is impossible. He writes that there in Hebrews 10, and that was always the case. If you sin against someone, don't go and sacrifice a dove and tell them, well, I've sacrificed a dove to it, we should be square. Go and apologize. It was a picture of what needed to happen. It's patterned after a greater reality, a heavenly reality. Let me ask you this. Just why was it so important that the tabernacle and then the temple, and even, I read that psalm before, you see, sometimes tabernacle and temple are just treated as if they're one and the same. The same psalm will talk about the temple and the tent, as if the temple is just the tabernacle. Sometimes they're treated differently, but so often they just merge together. The tabernacle was to be made according to the pattern that God gave Moses on the mountain. Exodus 25 verse 9 says, "Make this tabernacle and all its furnishing exactly like the pattern I will show you." You know, Moses wasn't to use his initiative. He wasn't to make it up. God said, here's the plan, stick to it. He essentially gave him blueprints. It's because the tabernacle, the temple, and all its furnishings were a model of a greater reality. And they could only correctly illustrate and teach that reality inasmuch as they accurately represented that reality. Coming to a close. We went to the Natural History Museum in London last year. And the building alone, if you've ever been there or seen pictures of it, it's incredible. It's a temple of Darwin to rival Solomon's. But for all that, it's a magnificent place to visit and glory in the wonders and beauty of God's creation. I'd say it's a day out. There's so much there. It's several days out, isn't it? If you haven't been, it's well worth a visit. Consider this an advert. But it's so big, it's massive, you could easily get lost. So to help you find your way around, you can get a map. Now, it's free to enter, which is good, but apparently you've got to pay £3 for the map. So it's still a bargain at twice the price. You can get a map. It's a visual representation of the museum. And it shows you to the different exhibitions and the facilities. So you can find where the dinosaurs are and just go straight there. That map will help you find your way around the museum. But if you were to go in, make your way through the queue, and you get through, and maybe you swipe to donate, you can do all that these days, and you get your map, and you stand there in the foyer, and you just look at your map, and that's all you do. Just what a great map, I'm enjoying this map. You're wasting your time, aren't you? Now, the map is useful in as much as it helps you navigate the reality which the map patterns. Because good as the drawings of the dinosaurs might be at the bottom of that map, they're not as good as the dinosaur skeletons they've got in the dinosaur bit. You need the map to help you find the reality. Solomon's temple, for all its grandeur, was a map that was meant to lead us to Christ Jesus. As we'll see next week, he is the true spiritual temple, the place where heaven and earth meet. It's in his shed blood, not the blood of sheep and bulls. It's in his blood there is full and final remission of sins, once for all. And we'll think about this more next time and how specifically it impacts us and our mission as Christians. But we need to understand this. Because there are Bible experts who know the minutest details of the temple more excellently than we ever will. They're much better read in all the archaeology and the comparative history and all that. And it's fascinating to investigate, like anything from archaeology. And the old temple, in terms of literature, is such a sophisticated book. I go on about this. It will reward a lifetime of study. But so many of these Bible experts, they don't know God. If your reading of the Bible doesn't lead you to fall to your knees at the feet of Jesus your Lord, then you are missing the whole point. These things are given to us to draw our hearts to Christ, to know him better. But as we finish, I want to try to excite you for a moment. Because think of Solomon stood there in awe of this just incredible temple that he's had built. When you get home, read the descriptions of the building of the temple and just be like, wow. The beauty of its architecture, the dressed stones, the gold and the gems, the fine wood panelling used in its construction. Imagine the peerless beauty of the carving and the hammered metalwork. It isn't just your sight as well. Think of the fragrant incense or the sounds of the temple choirs. Think of how every part of this builds in your senses to an overload of stimulation where your brain doesn't have a sufficient sense of wonder to take it all in. And then realize, reading these verses, looking at that spectacle, that you are still looking at the map. And the true reality after which the map is patterned remains ever grander, ever more beautiful, ever more glorious and wonderful, and far from being out of reach. This is the reality which God has invited us all to enter through the water and the blood. Do we see the surpassing beauty of Christ in the beauty of the temple? Because that's what we should see. Let's praise God together for his goodness. How pleased and blessed was